So where do we start?
So
Buddy?
you wanted to talk about, give us a little lesson on populism, right?
Yeah, well, I'll paraphrase some of Thomas Frank, who's a writer and I guess I don't know if you call him a social critic or whatever. He's
Well, hold on, but you got to set this up first. Like, what are we doing here? So, I guess this was kind of prompted by me wanting to kind of know your take on what the difference between populism and socialism, right? Because I feel like it kind of overlaps, but I'm
all
not
right.
really sure what the
Let's
difference
start with
is.
that. Let's
Okay.
start with that. Populism. I mean, they can overlap, but there's a lot of isms out there, right?
Mhm.
Capitalism, communism, populism, socialism, et cetera, et cetera. As far as I'm concerned, socialism is uh, a political program of a form. It can be a form of government where the state plays an active role in ensuring economic justice. So examples of that um, would be like Venezuela under Chavez and Maduro, or it could also be to some extent Germany under Merkel, in the sense that the state plays some role in guaranteeing certain rights like healthcare, education, to a more or lesser extent. So you can have some countries that are extremely socialist, where the state basically guarantees everything, maybe to the exclusion of private uh, institutions. And then there's the other along the continuum. There's also states like Germany where you have a private public uh, coexistence, right? So you can have both existing. But basically, socialism. I mean, the origin of that probably comes from the out of the 19th century, out of the workers' movements and the revolutions, from originally from the French Revolution, but basically 1848, when you had this upheaval in Germany and France, and there was resurgent nationalism, but there was also this idea that the common people have certain rights. And I think the theories of like Marx came out of that atmosphere. And the idea of socialism from a Marxist perspective is that that's on the continuum from capitalism, from feudalism to capitalism to socialism to communism. From a Marxist perspective, it's a very definite progression based kind of on the idea that Hegel, the German philosopher, had this idea of that there was an inexorable movement in history of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And then Marx said, well, we have to apply that to capitalism, that there's actually laws that govern history in the same way that laws govern, physical laws govern the material world. And whether or not you agree with that, that's what Marx was purporting. But socialism has a much broader meaning than just the Marxist interpretation. It could also just mean like a strong state role in ensuring social justice and kind of to temper capitalism, right? Because capitalism itself is ultimately going to result in these extremes of poverty and wealth and unbalanced power and injustice ultimately. So that's what socialism is. Now, populism is the idea that the people, the populace in Latin, that's where the word comes from, have an inherent uh, common sense, I would say, and rights that should be expressed politically, and that's what populism is. And a lot of times, when the elites get too concentrated and you get too much focus on a wealthy, supposedly expert, quote unquote, elite making decisions that end up being bad decisions, then a lot of times populism is a reaction to that. And populism in this country, we have a rich tradition of that, to start in actually the 1890s, when there was actually a party called the People's Party that was started to counter the elites who told the farmers and everything that it's just, if you're failing, it's just too bad. We can't really do anything about that, but that's just your problem. And so that there was this whole movement with William Jennings Bryan, who ran for president on the Democratic ticket in 1896 as a populist. And a parallel kind of is like Trump with the Republicans. The Democrats weren't that excited about William Jennings Bryan, but they kind of said, okay, we'll let him run as our candidate this time because he was so popular. He was a very, he was like 36 years old. He was from Nebraska, one-term representative, but a very eloquent, forceful speaker who articulated the voice of farmers and workers who felt like they were being exploited. And there was kind of this anti-elitism. And long story short, of course, they lost to William McKinley, the Republican in 1896, who was like the ultimate capitalist candidate, and populism kind of died down by the end of the 1890s. But as a result of that populist movement, that kind of transmogrified into the progressive movement, and you had things such as the income tax, working laws governing working conditions, women's suffrage. So a lot of these things that came out of the early decades of the 20th century had their roots in populism.
You think it was just a raising of awareness of government can do these things for us from that movement?
Right. Yeah. And I'm reading Thomas Frank's book now, The People Know, N-O, not K-N-O-W, A History of Antipopulism, is that that attacks on populism from the 1890s really parallel almost exactly the attacks on populism now. That the claim is that populism is right-wing, nationalistic, is run by demagogues like Trump, and this is a dangerous trend. And the people common people can't make the decisions. We need to have experts making the decisions, and people, who are, we need to have the wealthy elite, Jeff Bezos and the Elon Musk of the world, as well as the experts in the bureaucracy in Washington making decisions. And this was the idea, like in the early 60s, there was the Pentagon, you had McNamara, and there were people writing at the time saying this, isn't this great? We have these experts making decisions. And of course it led to the Vietnam War, and it led to, we had these decisions about invading Iraq that ended up being a disaster. So there is no, the so-called expert elite ends up making really bad decisions sometimes, but they will attack the populace as being kind of the uncouth, uneducated hordes who are just looking for handouts. And some of the attacks on Bernie Sanders' program, I
just want to say real quick. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
that's all right.
And that can kind of spiral, right? Because the fact that they view them so much as uneducated hordes shows their elitism, which then feeds into the populists' distrust,
right,
and want to break from.
And the classic case is Hillary calling them deplorables, right?
Exactly.
So it's like, these people they're not really qualified to make decisions. And basically, if you fail, that's just too bad. And it's interesting, the Democratic Party went from being the party of slavery in the post-Civil War period to the party of Roosevelt, which was the progressive party of workers, right, and farmers, and then it has become the party of the top 10%, whereas and this is to paraphrase Thomas Frank again, they become the party of the top 10%, whereas Republicans are the party of the top 1%, or maybe the 0.1%. The Democrats represent elites, maybe a slightly broader swath of elites, but still represent elites, and basically aren't doing anything for people on the bottom, So Trump can do some things. He's not a populist.
I don't know, though. Cenk Uygur is telling me he's going to push Biden to the left, no matter what.
All right, hold on, Steve, because he's been going on tangents here. Right?
Yes.
So, all right. So, would you say that so populism is an ideology, right? And it can, I guess, the ultimate manifestation of that in government-wise would be socialism, right?
Um, yes, I mean, the ultimate manifestation would be communism, like you had in I mean, and people would argue with that, but I would say, like, you know, a
But
workers farmer
communism
state.
gives the government the control, right? Or is that the socialism that gives the government the control?
Well, in the idea in communism is that you have a dictatorship of the proletariat, which is the working class. So the working class is, in theory, is dominating the government. So there's the government of the workers. You have these workers' councils. In Russia, they were called Soviets. They were the workers' councils. So the idea is that every factory you had workers' councils making decisions about how to run the factory, who to hire, and the result was disastrous because it was the opposite extreme. You know, you had people who really
But
didn't know
wouldn't that be
anything.
kind of the equivalent of like a workers co-op, a worker co-op,
Right,
in
right,
that's being pushed
right, right.
now?
You know, and having, like in Germany, you have workers, you have employees on the boards of corporations as required. So that's kind of moving in that direction. Whereas in this
I'm sorry
country,
if I,
you don't have that.
I'm sorry, do you want to say, but a workers co-op would be different in that workers co-op, you're talking about the workers essentially owning the factory, right?
They have a stake, yes. They have
Well,
they
a
have
stake.
a financial stake,
in it.
so they want to see it run correctly. So they might do something. They want to see it profit. So they might bring in outside experts to make it work. Whereas you're talking in the Soviet situation, these people have to have a job. You know, they have a job and they have a stake in running the factory, but they don't have any differing financial stake in whether or not that factory churns out 100,000 widgets a year or 10,000 widgets a year, right? So it's different when you're removing a financial incentive, which can make all the difference, right?
Right, and under the Soviet system, they didn't have financial incentives. It was based on.
That's what I'm saying.
You did kind of like they had people could, you know, you could win if you won the Stalin Prize under Stalin. You got like
there you go,
10,000 rubles or something, which is like not that much money.
Yeah.
But basically, it was like they gave out medals left and right, right? So like you got. You know, you got Soviet Hero of Labor if you beat the quota on coal mining or something like that. So it was based on incentives, non-monetary incentives to a large degree. But yeah, I mean, what form does that take? I don't know. It's not always clear cut because, like, Richard Wolff, right? The NYU Marxist, probably the preeminent Marxist economist today, and he's all
Isn't
over
he
YouTube.
a professor emeritus at Harvard or something?
Yeah, I don't know if
pretty
he was.
Sure. He lives here in Massachusetts.
I thought he was in, and I'm not sure where he is, but he's like, he's another, from that New York Jewish Brooklyn tradition, like a Bernie Sanders, and he really is a Marxist, and he's an interesting character, but he talks about how he had, setting up workers councils or workers cooperatives, but other than that, it's not really, how do you actually get there?
Well, actually, it's funny because that you mentioned him, because I actually just saw something that he put out. He has a show called Economic Update, and I don't always tune into what he's putting out, but the fact that he interviewed someone who is a friend of his from Cuba, and she was talking about how, if I'm not mistaken, she said that I think 70% of like businesses are actually worker co-ops in Cuba. It's actually gotten to the point where they have tried to transition more of the power to, and Cuba is a communist country. And for me, I feel something personal because of the fact that my mom was Cuban. And so, I have very mixed feelings about Cuba and about Fidel Castro and all that, because obviously my family fled from Cuba, so it's very difficult to see that there are positive things that are going on there when the only narrative that you hear coming from anyone that's living in Miami or that has left Cuba is that Cuba is like the worst place in the world.
Yeah. Well, it's changed since in the post-Castro era or the post-Fidel
since his
era.
brother,
Under Raul, there was a lot more opening up. So they have a lot of small, restaurants can be owned privately now, or these small shops that depend on the tourist trade. And
well, the majority of the co-ops that they have is actually land, and what they do is that they like, I guess for every she didn't talk about this, but I had actually seen like another documentary about this previously, where they, I guess for like every community, they have a group of people that the government gives them a loan essentially so that they can have a worker co-op, right? And they can, and so they grow the food that is necessary for the community, and it's free, you know, they don't, the community doesn't have to pay for anything, this is all a part of it. And the way that they learn obviously how to grow it's more sustainable. It's something, it's like the whole, you know, teach a man to fish metaphor, right?
Right.
Mhm.
Right. I mean, we have no populism. We're like the most unpopulous populist country in the world, I think. I mean, maybe there's another country like that's not, but I mean, we have, I mean, case example is like the opinion of people is not reflected in legislation, right? So like, you know, even most Republicans support gun control, right? Or even most Republicans support some kind of Medicare for all, but it's and a vast majority of people support that, but it's not reflected in the government. So we don't have any populist expression in government, you know. So it's gotten worse over time. So that, I mean, that's why we need some kind of populism. And Bernie Sanders, that whole movement was just, I mean, they took the wind out of their sails totally, right, in the primaries, and it's just never. I mean, Biden obviously is not part of that progressive, you know, populist.
He's the antithesis of it.
He's the antithesis of it. I mean, he'll give some lip
But that's
service
because
to
Nancy
it.
Pelosi says we don't actually want change. Remember,
That's right.
Steve, you don't want
Yeah.
change.
Yeah.
Well,
and Nancy knows best.
And you're right. And she actually, yeah, when she said we, she literally put it on the people. She literally said the people don't want change. Basically, they're happy with what they got. Yeah.
But I mean, she's
We'll
the
see.
ultimate elitist with her ice cream freezer and everything.
Oh, sure.
You know, that's the opposite side of populism is elitism. So you have elitists, especially incompetent.
Which that's what the Democratic Party, it's like synonymous with elitism now, right? Like especially the right, that is what they just bunch everybody who is on the left or a Democrat. They say, oh, you're an elitist, essentially.
Right. But I mean, they're like, it's like the pot calling the kettle black, because the Republicans are also, for the most part, except for there's a libertarian.
Oh, I'm talking about the base, not the Republicans in
Oh, that's the Republican Party. Okay.
Yeah.
But a lot of
Republicans,
Republicans,
talking about the base, like the actual, like the people that are actually going for Trump. You know, for them,
right.
The one of the major reasons why they went for Trump the first time, it was because it was supposed to be a major, big middle finger to the establishment, to the elite, right?
Right.
And but the other thing that I was thinking about this was that, okay, so I think of populism, and it made me think of essentially it's really supposed to be ultimately democracy. What really democracy is supposed to be really is that everyone has a voice, right? And obviously we think about this now because of the Electoral College, and you know, should we abolish the Electoral College, and then you know the repercussions of that. But but then I think to myself, you know, first of all, we don't live in a democracy, right? And I'm talking about little d democracy, not.
And we never have.
Yeah, and we never have, exactly. But it's supposedly even our founding fathers thought that it was not okay for the majority, like, because democracy is essentially like mob rule, right? It's that everybody has a say. And then it made me think about how Socrates was, and that we think about Athens, you know, we think about Greece as like you know, that is where the birthplace of democracy, right? But then Socrates, who was this our forefather of the philosophy, right? He was so against it, you know, and it actually brought his demise, right? Because he was actually he was accused by like 500 Athenians or whatever, just regular people, and they sentenced him to death. You know, and so it actually, like, his argument against it was what the ironic thing was, that it actually brought his death to him.
Well, I mean, the founding fathers, you bring that up, it's a good example, because the founding fathers, I mean, to some extent they were populist, right? Because they said, you know, of the people, whatever, we the people, right? So that's a populist sentiment. But on the other hand, they made the House of Representatives. That's a populist House branch of government of the Congress. But the Senate was, I mean, it was until like the 17th Amendment or whatever amendment it was, it was selected by the state legislatures. So the people did not vote directly for the senators, and we still have the electoral college.
It's almost like the super delegates of today, right?
Yeah, but I mean, it wasn't democratic, and the Supreme Court is not democratic. So the founding fathers were very wary of pure democracy. They didn't want it, and also, like, women didn't have a vote, and if you were a
Black
slave,
people
you
were
were
only 3/5 of a person.
Right, 3/5 of a person. So this whole, going back to the originalists, going back to the founding fathers. I mean, you have to, like, does that mean they agree with like this whole attitude that you can't trust the people? And the whole anti-populism now going on, it's like they're attacking the people. And yeah, you can have mob rule, and the classic case is like the French Revolution, where you had a popular uprising, and then you had the Jacobins take over under Robespierre, and they started beheading everybody, right? For like, and everybody, like, they would take like a merchant and they would behead the whole family and their servants and everything, and children, and it was just like horrible. So that's, if you let the mob take over, according to the anti-populists, then we're going to end up with something like that. We're going to end up with executions in Central Park, to paraphrase Chris Matthews, right?
Chris Matthews, exactly. I was going to bring him up.
I mean,
I know, but you know what I think is funny? The fact that most people think that, like, what we just described as like mob rule, that is anarchy, right? When in actuality, it is democracy. It almost feels like an oxymoron.
Well, yeah, but in the French Revolution, you had these like tribunals, pronouncing a sentence in the morning, and the execution would be carried out in the afternoon. So it was not really democracy. It was kind of, and like, the parallels like Stalinism, right, where you had these show trials and people were put on trial, and basically they said, if you confess that you were an agent of fascist Germany, we'll spare your family. You'll still be executed, but we'll spare your family. So these people would confess. I mean, that wasn't democracy, but that happened.
Or was it? Because if that's what the majority of the people want,
right,
then.
Well, I don't think the majority of people wanted that in that system, and then they,
who knows?
And then Khrushchev.
I don't know. Khrushchev, people are pretty sick.
22nd
people
Party
used
Congress.
To like to watch, these executions and burnings, and I mean,
there's also just the problem
like some pretty sick stuff.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, a mob is a mob democracy. I mean, a mob, when no one has individual responsibility, right? If you're all shouting, yeah, execute that person, burn that witch, etc. It's because no one person has responsibility. Everyone can just go along with whatever the exciting thing is, or whatever,
Right. I think about Gaddafi. That's the ultimate to me, is Gaddafi. What they did to him, the way that they did that in public. It's like.
Right. Or
that's modern time, like, people really don't think that happens today, and it does.
I think we talk about democracy, we mean some kind of organized political system where you have, one person, one vote, or you have some kind of structure, and not just, a crowd of people calling for, lock her up or whatever.
Something that causes some kind of level of responsibility rather than simply shouting out.
But then you have the argument that, again, going back to like Socrates, right? That what they argued was that if you're going to have everybody voting, that they should be educated, right? You don't want just like anybody going, because of the kind of stuff that can happen. And so that kind of leans into how people nowadays, I mean, first of all, most people don't even vote, unfortunately. But they're definitely, the majority of people that actually do vote are not educated. They're not making an educated decision. They're usually just following whatever the person that they trust to tell them, what to do, then that's what they do.
I mean, look at the Biden campaign ads. Like the last couple of weeks are like him hugging children, and I mean, hugging children in a kind of respectful way, and like just these platitudes about whatever, restore integrity to our government. I mean, it's just like all BS, right? Because it's just, and it is really contemptuous of the masses. I think people, they just figure like, we're not gonna address these complicated issues like foreign policy or whatever. We're just gonna, we have a few feel good images of American flag and Biden, being a nice guy, and therefore you should vote for him.
Right. And you know how Cenk Uygur says that he's going to push Biden or whatever, you're going to need to have the numbers to push him, right? And the majority of people, because they're so uninformed on what's going on, they're not going to know what to hold him accountable for. So
It's
all
not
of
gonna,
this stuff.
it's not gonna happen. It's not gonna
Right.
happen.
That's what I'm saying. That
Yeah,
he's not going to be held to account.
You'll get a $15 minimum wage, and that's about it.
yeah.
You
That's
think so?
interesting, the idea of like how many hours do you have to dedicate in order to be a successful participant in our democracy or our our government. It seems like in order to understand enough to really be able to make a judgment on who to vote for president or this or that, the bar is kind of high, right? You have to know a lot.
Yeah. On the other hand, you have like, people know that they want health care, right? And they know the system we have now is totally fucked up.
And they know that neither
right
one of those
that.
candidates is going to give them that health care.
Yeah,
right.
So
I mean,
so you're right. That's right. So that's probably the best way for the average person out there. Again, I don't want to put myself in this elitist. I just happen to be stupid and have time to look at this stuff, I guess. But the average person that doesn't have a bunch of time to look at this, if you simply pick, okay, what's the most important thing to me right now? We on the domestic side, we need healthcare. On the international side, don't get into wars. You should be able to get a gut read on people for those and just look at records and get a feel for that. That's probably the most successful way people can.
I mean, look at the Our Revolution movement
successfully.
got so much support, and then it was just quashed.
Right.
Because Bernie would have won in 2016 if he had run. I'm pretty sure. I mean, because he was very, very popular. His movement was very, very popular because it was a populist movement.
We don't know how he would have done with the Electoral College because.
Well, look at this. He won in Michigan in the primary overwhelmingly against Hillary Clinton in 2016. So I mean,
but that's not the Electoral College, though.
It's not, but the Electoral College is decided in those upper Midwest states a lot of times because you know which way the South is going to go and you know which way the coasts are going to go. But a lot of times those swing states are Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan. Those.
But technically, the Electoral College, or at least not in all states, they don't have to vote the way that their population votes. Some of the states, yes, you are required to, but not all of them. Well, so that's what I'm saying, that it's like, it really doesn't matter.
Put it this way, he had a fighting chance, right? I mean,
for sure. Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, the system is stacked against democracy, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not fair. Okay, just to tie up this discussion of socialism versus populism, I would say socialism is a form of government, whereas populism is a political phenomenon or a movement, or it can be you can have right-wing populism, from a leader, or you can have a mass party, a mass movement on the ground, such as the Farmers Alliance of the 1890s, that's calling for a certain policy that's populism. Or there could be a party expression of that, like the People's Party or Movement for a People's Party. Those are populist trends, but populism is not. You can't say populism is not a form of government. Socialism is, and socialism tends to be more populist than some other forms of government. I would say. So that to me that's the difference between them, and they can overlap. I mean, you can have a populist socialist like Chavez and Maduro in Venezuela, right? And you can have a populist. You can have Hitler with a National Socialist German Workers' Party, right? Which is the name, but I mean, it was socialist in the sense that it was a strong state allied with industry, trying to implement racial policies and nationalist policies. So to that extent, it was socialist. But I think usually you think of socialist as being creating more justice for for the people as a whole, not just, you know, the select racial group or whatever.
But see, that's what your interpretation of what I was trying to say is that it always seems as though there's this link between socialism and populism. And so it almost makes it so that it's like it's very hard to delineate what the difference is between the two, because it seems like they have the same objective, right?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think more in the Marxist sense of socialism as being a form of government that tries to redistribute wealth to some extent, or at least temper the extremes of capitalism, whether it's, you know, Christian socialism or democratic socialism or, you know, pure socialism. That's how I see it. So that is my interpretation. So maybe we'll leave it there.
All right.